The Manchester Chartist, Chapter 10. Michael O'Donnell, the union official, visited the Ackroyd home that evening, as he'd promised. Bess and Daniel stayed up talking to him long after their normal time for bed. Small and slim, blessed with thick black hair, Michael had blue brooding eyes. A young-looking 39-year-old, he told them he'd been born in a small village outside Belfast to a Protestant family, although they were Irish speakers, as was the Catholic community in which they lived. He'd served an apprenticeship as a spinner in a lime cotton mill, starting work at the age of 10. Here he'd met John Doherty, a young lad of his own age from Donegal, who previously worked in a cotton mill in his own village and subsequently one at Trim. Meeting Doherty changed his life. At the age of 18 they both moved to Manchester, seeking work, and obtained employment together in a mill. At this point both joined the Manchester Cotton Spinners Society, an organisation then illegal under the terms of the Combination Acts. He'd aroused Bess's interest with this information. She'd attended 2 meetings at which John Doherty had spoken, but had been unaware of his background. She asked how they became involved in trade unionism. Michael explained that in 1818, 1 year after their arrival, out of desperation resulting from the spiralling cost of food, the spinners struck work for higher wages. During the turnout, John Doherty had been arrested for assault whilst picketing, a charge in fact based on fabricated evidence, as Michael testified in court. Nonetheless, the jury found John guilty, and the judge sentenced him to 2 years' hard labour in Lancaster Castle. This radicalised both men, particularly Michael, who'd accompanied John throughout the dispute and knew without a doubt his friend was innocent of any assault. Michael had subsequently taken part in the meeting on St. Peter's Fields in 1819, and the horrific events he'd witnessed that day intensified his determination to fight for radical change. He related to Bess and Daniel how, on Doherty's release from prison in 1821, he sought him out. Both participated in various political campaigns over subsequent years, in particular those for the repeal of the Combination Acts, against the new Poor Law of 1834, and for parliamentary reform. John Doherty had also been involved in efforts to repeal the Corn Laws, although Michael disagreed with him strongly on this issue. He saw it as a dispute between the landed gentry and the manufacturers, and not one the working classes should waste their energy on. Convinced the repeal of the taxes on imported food would only result in a new excuse for the manufacturers to cut wages. Michael argued that whilst the Corn Laws added to the manufacturers' production costs, because they had to pay sufficient wages for their workers to subsist on, and this reduced their competitiveness internationally, once the laws were repealed, the manufacturers' prices could only be reduced as cheaper food was imported if they cut their operatives' wages by the appropriate amount. If they didn't cut wages accordingly, the mill owners, unable to reduce prices, would derive no benefit. All their campaigning for repeal would be of no avail to them. As profit was the end-all and be-all of capitalist endeavour, Michael remained convinced wage cuts were as inevitable as night followed day. Despite their disagreement on this issue, both men continued to work together, their friendship and their common concerns over a wide range of issues proving stronger than a temporary policy disagreement on a single issue. In any case, their differences became increasingly irrelevant as the overwhelming majority of workers refused to support the Anti-Corn Law League anyway. Basic instinct and long experience convinced the workers the free traders Cobden and Bright and their ilk only sought their support out of their own narrow self-interest as manufacturers, and would show the workers their true colours as soon as their campaign was won, as they had in the Great Betrayal of 1832. One issue in particular united John and Michael above all others. They were appalled at the way industrialisation and the factory system had become reliant on child labour, and how it destroyed any semblance of family life. They saw this as the key challenge facing the trade union movement, and vowed to do something about it. In this regard they had personal experience, both having started work at the age of 10. Accordingly they campaigned tirelessly to win the Manchester Spinners to campaign to outlaw the practice. In 1828 Doherty initiated the formation of the Society for the Protection of Children Employed in Cotton Factories. In the same year he stood for election as secretary of the Manchester Spinners Union, formed following the repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824 and 1825. Much to Michael's surprise, despite John's Irish nationality and his Catholicism, neither a natural asset in any form of popularity contest in England, even amongst the working classes, he won the election and within months faced a new challenge. The Manchester mill owners in April 1829 began to impose wage cuts. For a workforce already living hand-to-mouth in the most abject conditions, the situation facing them was intolerable. Speedy and outright starvation threatened to replace intermittent hunger, unless they took action. Doherty and most of the union delegates knew they were in a difficult position, with few funds to support a long dispute. At the same time, they recognised the spinners had little option but to take action, withdraw their labour and refuse reduced wages. If they didn't, the manufacturers would not only impose their wage cuts on this occasion, but once discovering they were unopposed, would repeat the exercise time and time again. There was no room for negotiation or for alternatives, even if the mill owners had the basic courtesy to listen to their employees' plight in the first place. By imposing wage cuts, the manufacturers were in effect declaring social war. The spinners responded by declaring a turnout, which, to the mill owners' surprise and disgust, lasted 6 long months, until the following October, when, with no more funds to support them and winter fast approaching, they were finally forced to return to work on the employers' terms. Blooded but unbowed, Doherty organised a national meeting of spinners, which formed the Grand General Union of Operative Spinners of the United Kingdom, and shortly after organised a meeting of Manchester trade unionists. They decided to form a General Union of Trades, with the purpose of providing support to fellow trade unionists involved in future industrial disputes. Doherty, steadily increasing in popularity and stature amongst all Manchester working people, both within and outside the textile trade, became editor of his publication, the United Trades Cooperative Journal, in March 1830, ensuring it communicated information, encouraged debate amongst trade unionists, and exposed the worst of the manufacturers. Appalled at this turn of events, the government banned the journal the following October. Doherty once again rose to the challenge, under no illusion as to how difficult it was for workers to organise in unions and to make those unions effective in the battle to defend their working conditions. Competition between the manufacturers, resulting from their determination to boost their profits and their personal wealth, and their persistent attempts to undercut each other, forced them to try to undermine any advances made by the workers, and to seek cuts in wages, whilst increasing output. Thus the laissez-faire economic system corrupted the masters as surely as it impoverished their hands, driving out any traces of human feelings and compassion, and reducing every moral question and each personal relationship between master and operative to one of cash. Inevitably, this self-same anarchic competition led to overproduction, saturated markets, and brought about periodic economic crises, resulting in even greater pressures to reduce wages, to introduce short-time working, and more often than not wholesale layoffs and mill closures, until all the unsold goods have found buyers and trade returned to normal. This in turn created an intensified competition between the workers themselves, with those out of work under pressure to accept reduced wages in order to secure jobs. For male workers, the employer's ability to use women's and children's labour wherever possible exacerbated the situation. They paid less for female labour, and in the case of thousands of parish children shipped from the workhouses all over Britain, enjoyed the benefit of exploiting their labour power, virtually free of charge and certainly free of wages. By 1830, there were just over 550 mills in South East Lancashire, employing 110,000 workers, of whom no less than 35,000 were children, some as young as 6 years of age. Doherty recognised the only way for workers to break this vicious cycle was to combine together and do everything possible to end the competition between them. Whilst all too many strikes ended in failure, at least employers were beginning to realise there was a price to be paid for their attacks on workers' living standards. Workers were also realizing it was better to go down fighting like human beings than continue to be treated worse than slaves. Some very tentatively and slowly were learning other lessons, particularly the need to take action before things became bad and crisis took hold. In other words, to hit the manufacturers when they were at their busiest and most vulnerable to industrial action, to fight for real and substantial improvements in living and working standards, rather than to continually try and defend the status quo, to break out of the defensive mode and go on to the attack. Michael O'Donnell in particular had already reached this conclusion, but creating the conditions in which his ideas could be tested remained another matter. It would be a long time before this concept of offensive action became generally understood, and years would pass before most unions took it on board. Essentially, they were purely defensive organisations. Nonetheless, most workers knew they had to take action, even when everything seemed unwinnable. As Michael put it, if we have a choice between starving whilst working a 14-hour day, or starving whilst fighting for our children, our families, and our fellow workers, I reckon we might as well choose the latter. At least we'd retain our dignity and assert our right to be treated as human beings, and not as a mere appendage of a manufacturer's machine, or another commodity to be bought and sold and discarded when they decide they no longer need us. He explained how Doherty helped organise the National Association for the Protection of Labour. Over 20 different trades joined the organisation within a few months. By 1831 it spread from Lancashire to the Midlands and Staffordshire and had a membership of over 100,000 workers. Once again, Doherty's belief in the importance of communication between the trade unions and workers generally, the need to supply information, to educate and to organise, led him to a new publishing initiative. This time, in the spring of 1832, he opened a print shop, a small bookstore in Manchester, and published The Voice of the People. Soon the premises included a coffee house, where 96 other newspapers could be read. Again he was sent to prison, as a result of complaints made by the Reverend Gilpin, a Manchester clergyman who headed a group of Christians opposed to all those arguing for democracy. He'd taken umbrage at some of the articles in Doherty's newspaper, claiming they were blasphemous. Prison only whetted Doherty's appetite for more action and strengthened his resolve. On his release, he joined forces with Richard Osler and Michael Sadler MP in their campaign against child labour and for the 10 Hours Bill. In doing so, Doherty helped form the Manchester Short Time Committee and began publishing a new journal, The Poor Man's Advocate. Bess was more than impressed with Michael's account of John Doherty's activities, finding inspiration in the fact he could remain fighting for other people's rights after being subjected to so many setbacks. Above all, she agreed and identified with the campaign against child labour, having already resolved with Daniel that they'd do everything possible to ensure young Daniel enjoyed his childhood and wouldn't have to start work until he was 14 if they had the power to prevent it. On the face of it, Osler was a strange bedfellow of John Doherty and Michael O'Donnell. He was a supporter of the Tory party, and his beliefs owed much to the class relationships of the pre-industrial era. He'd opposed universal suffrage and trade unions. However, he believed it was the absolute duty of the rich and privileged, and in particular those in power, to protect the weak and vulnerable, and especially their children. Bess had been at a meeting organised by Doherty in 1836, when Richard Osler, who was without doubt a powerful orator, had explained how he'd met a Bradford worsted wool mill owner, Mr. John Wood, who'd appealed to him to fight against the scourge of child labour in 1830. Pregnant with Daniel at the time, she could still remember his precise words. They'd made such an impact on her. John Wood turned towards me, Osler informed his audience. He reached out his hand and in the most impressive manner pressed my hand in his. He said, "I've had no sleep tonight. I've been reading the Bible, and in every page I've read my own condemnation. I cannot allow you to leave me without a pledge that you will use all your influence in trying to remove from our factory system the cruelties which are practised in our mills. I promised I would do what I could. I felt that we were, each of us, in the presence of the highest, and I knew that that vow was recorded in heaven. Osler had railed at the manufacturers and their hypocrisy, pointing out the mill owners obtained their wealth by overworking and underpaying all their workers, and by defrauding the factory children in particular, robbing them of their childhood, their innocence, their health, all too often their limbs, and on many occasions their lives. They murder the innocents like modern Herods, he insisted. The manufacturers are religious people, praying people, but they take great care their work people should neither have time nor strength to pray. These hypocrites pretend it's necessary to keep these poor infant slaves at this excruciating labour, just to preserve them from bad company, and to prevent them learning bad habits. He'd gone on to explain how John Wood and other informants had told him, children are often awakened by their parents at 4 a.m. They are pulled out of bed when almost asleep. The younger children are carried on the backs of the older children asleep to the mill, and they see no more of their parents till they go home at night and are sent to bed. And after 10 hours or so hard, dangerous labour, when they are falling asleep due to exhaustion, they are often beaten by the overseers in order to force them to complete 12 and even 14 hours work a day. Much to everybody's surprise, apart from that of John Doughty perhaps, who had spent many hours with him, Osler the Tory then urged workers to use not only strikes, but sabotage in their campaigns for the ending of child labour, enforceable factory legislation, shorter working hours, and changes in the poor law. His continuing advocacy of such tactics was to lead indirectly to his subsequent imprisonment in 1840, but that was in the future. At the same meeting, John Doughty, recalling a speech he'd made back in 1832, at another public event he'd addressed with Osler, pointed out, Mr. Osler is a Tory in politics, but then we have a right to ask, will any of your boasting Liberals or professing Whigs contribute a tithe of the service which Mr. Osler has rendered to the cause of suffering humanity? Unfortunately, men like Osler were few and far between, as Best knew only all too well. Successive parliaments have been made aware of the systematic overworking, the maiming, torturing, and in effect murder of innocents that have been part of the factory system since its very inception. They not only knew, but also commanded the power to intervene, to regulate and prevent such excesses, but to their eternal shame they turned a blind eye. Bess had ears to hear, eyes to see and to read, and a brain to comprehend. She was all too aware the Lords spiritual in their mitres and embroidered cassocks, the Lords temporal in their ermined robes, and the law lords in their powdered wigs. All knew, each and every one of them without exception, of the terrible suffering endured by the factory children in particular, and workers in general, as did their law-making Tory and Whig colleagues in the Commons. Best knew these self-appointed and near enough self-elected guardians of the nation discussed the need for minimal education for the children of the working classes, a discussion that always founded ever so conveniently on arguments between the various Christian sects and the Church of England as to which versions of the Bible should be used. The Church of England insisting all children, Catholic, Jews, nonconformists and dissenters alike, should use the state-approved King James authorised version of the Scriptures and the Book of Common Prayer as the only sources of reading in schools. These debates in Parliament were no doubt interesting from a theological point of view, but Bess, like the vast majority of workers, couldn't give a toss about theology, and knew such sectarian and petty irrelevant arguments should never have been deployed in order to withhold the meagre provisions for some sort of regular education on offer. This was how the churches did their Christian duty, preventing any move towards progress for working children, and through their sectarian bickering, encouraged atheism amongst their abandoned flocks, and then berated the poor for being infidels, heathens and blasphemers. She knew how their high and mighty similarly discussed means to control the worst excesses of the manufacturers. Some wrung their hands in mock despair, whilst others made fine pious speeches. The followers of the self-appointed prophet Malthus blamed the poor for creating poverty and insisted no aid be provided, save the prod of the poor law and the fear of the workhouse treadmill. The great men of learning and privilege, in whose hands the governance of the British Empire resided, ordered investigation after investigation, amassed knowledge, facts and figures, documented outbreaks of infectious diseases, and wrote whole libraries of great reports on health, sanitation, bad housing, filthy water supplies, and industrial accidents, running into hundreds of thousands of words. They even passed factory acts limiting the hours children and women could work. The first in 1819, the second in 1825, and the third in 1831. Then, having passed their laws and done their duty to their own smug satisfaction, they turned their backs and did nothing of any use or of practical benefit, even allowing their own factory acts to remain inoperative and inoperable. Best knew how, in contrast to the vicious new poor law, each and every one of these acts was honoured overwhelmingly in the breach, enforcement being all too little and any punishment all too puny. Too few inspectors were employed. The majority of those inspectors weren't particularly convinced of the need for legislation in the first place, and any inspectors with serious intent had to give employers so much prior notice in writing before they paid a visit to inspect any premises. The outcome was all too obvious. In any event, the magistrates who dealt with the few cases that came before them were all manufacturers to a man. Above all, Bess knew the only people workers could really rely upon for aid and assistance were, with few exceptions, working people themselves, and especially those such as Michael O'Donnell and John Doherty. Just as the poorest of the poor knew, the only people they could rely on for aid were also poor. Sensible beggars in London or Manchester, Birmingham or Liverpool, Glasgow or Cardiff, Dublin or Belfast, were rarely seen in the commercial districts or amongst the suburbs of the rich, but in the poorest working class areas. The people who really understood the cruel tragedy of factory life had suffered it, and those who understood hunger best were those like Bess and her fellow workers who'd been hungry. Bitter experience had taught most of the working poor in the Manchester and other industrial areas of 1838 they too could be injured or starving or both in the not-too-distant future. Bess had often despaired, feeling the obstacles working people faced were just too daunting. Persuading people to attend a meeting after many hours of hard, soul-destroying work was an uphill task in itself, let alone expect them to risk their jobs and hence their livelihoods by taking action. The fact ordinary people like Michael O'Donnell and John Doherty could rise from the morass, educate themselves, and selflessly work for the benefit of their fellows, risking imprisonment and blacklisting by employers, provided new hope and inspiration, kindling the flames of her own determination. At the same time she realised just how important Daniel's love and support was to her, as indeed was that of Irene Rose. The mill owner's daughter provided a glorious and inspiring exception to the rule, being a traitor to her class, if ever there was one. Bess vowed not to allow herself to be weakened, or to let them, her son, or her workmates down.